kids. So I am not sure. I grew up in a Baptist church where, dancing is not really, I don't know if it's really allowed, so I'm pretty sure half of us are going to hell this morning. No, isn't that awesome to have times of worship like that? It's so fun to be able to worship in so many different ways. I love that. If you guys have been with us over the last few weeks, or if you have watched online, you know that we are in a series right now that we are just calling Engage. And this series is one where we're walking through the book of James. So we've been taking one chapter at a time, one chapter a week. We've been walking through this. And hopefully you've been reading the book of James with us. You've been going through this maybe more than once over the last several weeks. And really the question that we're asking is the same thing that James addresses. It's the question that he addresses throughout this little letter that he has given us. The question is, what would it look like if we really engaged our faith? What would it look like if we really took the words of Jesus seriously and started to live them out day after day, week after week? What would that mean for our families? What would that mean at our workplaces? What would that mean in our church and in our community? What would it look like if we really started to engage our faith? And so as we get into chapter 4 today, we are actually going to be looking at something that I think is one of the most important aspects of all of Christianity. If we get this one thing right, it changes the way that we relate to God. It changes the way that we relate to each other. And so I think this is an incredibly important thing that we're going to be looking at. But at the same time, this is one of those things that we just tend to resist it. We don't like this. We give mental assent to it. We say, yeah, I believe that. I know I should do that. But when it comes to actually living it out, it's a little bit harder for us. And so I think this is going to be something really important for us to look at this morning. But before we just dive into that, let me ask you a question. And this is a loaded question, so don't answer out loud, okay? The question is this: what is the secret ingredient, or what is the ingredient that you need if you're going to have a healthy marriage? Like I said, don't answer out loud, but take that and extend it a little further. If you look at just relationships, if you look at family, is there something that you can think of that you need to have this ingredient, this thing in your family in order for your family to function the way that it's supposed to function? This same thing can be applied to the entire community. What if we looked at the entire community? What is kind of the secret ingredient of community working the way that it's supposed to work? As we get into this, what I think you're going to see is that in order for us to have healthy marriages, in order for us to have healthy families and communities, one of those secret ingredients that you have to have is that you have to have somebody who is occasionally willing to take one for the team. You guys know what I mean by that? You have to have somebody in the relationship, one spouse or both or whatever, that comes to a point where they eventually say, you know what, I'm going to put your interest above my own. I'm going to take one for the team here. In our family, the way this works is we've got a few scenarios where we play this out on a regular basis. One of those is when someone comes to sell something or comes and knocks on our door, whether they're selling solar panels or whether they are, Mormons or Jehovah's Witnesses or whatever the case may be. If somebody comes to our door, we have a couple of responses that we may issue at that time. The first response is that we say, everybody be really still, don't walk in front of the doors, don't walk in front of the windows, don't let them know we're here. Even though all of the cars are in the driveway, we're going to act like nobody's home, right? That's response number one. Don't turn lights on and off, that kind of stuff. They'll figure us out. So that's response number one. Response number two is generally if I'm not home, what will happen is JD will go and she will answer the door. My wife will answer the door. And when she does, she has a set thing that she says, regardless of what's happening. If they're selling a product, if they're selling a religious system, whatever, her standard response every time is, I know you're selling this product, but unfortunately my husband makes all of the financial decisions in our home, and I can't make any of those decisions. And he's not here right now, right? So it may be that, or if it's, you know, somebody talking about faith or religion, I mean, she defaults to the same thing. My husband makes all of the spiritual decisions here. I just can't think on my own, and I can't make those kind of decisions. And so she puts that off on me, and I end up taking it for the team, right? Because about a week later, the same person comes back around and knocks on the door again, and, hey, is your husband at home this time, right? And so I'm the one who has to go and say, we don't want whatever it is, you know, and I have to be the bad guy. I think you know what I'm talking about. All of us at times, if we're going to have healthy relationships, have to be willing to take one for the team occasionally, right? If you're a parent, you may have experienced this in a different way. It may be that you've taken one for your child, where your child came to you and said, this person asked me to go play, but I really don't want to do that today. And so you have to be the one to say, okay, well, here's my answer. You're not allowed to go play with them right now. And so in our family, again, the way this happens is my kids go back and they tell whoever, I'm sorry, my dad, you know, he's strict. He's the pastor. He won't let me play today. And so they give that kind of excuse, and I take it for the team, right? That's what you do at times when you care about the way that your relationships are developed. And so what I think you're going to see today is what James says in chapter 4. Is he says that if we want to do community well, if we want to develop relationships the right way, if we want to engage our faith in a way that is meaningful, that shapes the relationships around us, you have to be willing to take one for the team at times. You have to be willing at times to say, I care more about the needs or the desires of others than I do about my own needs or desires in this moment. And so I'm going to take one for the team. You have to at least get to a point where you think of the community as a team, right? As people that it's not, I'm getting my way and hopefully they'll get their way, but we're working together. We're doing this together as a team. So that's where James is going to take us this morning, as he's saying that if you want to do relationships well, and by the way, community is huge, right? I mean, this matters more than almost anything else. And James is pointing out in chapter 3 and chapter 4, he's saying, regardless of where you come from in life, community matters. You need to do this well. It doesn't matter if you're an introvert or an extrovert. It doesn't matter if you love being in crowds or if you get social anxiety if you're in a crowd. You need community. And so to do this well, you have to think in terms of team. And occasionally there has to be somebody that takes one for the team. Just to remind you where we were last week, in case you weren't able to be here or if you missed it. Last week we looked at James chapter 3 and we were talking about the tongue. And James was saying that if we're going to have the right kind of relationships, if we're going to develop the kind of relationships that God wants us to have, if we're going to engage properly, we have to be able to control our tongue. We talked about the fact that everybody needs a filter. Some people show that more than others, right? And the way that they talk, everybody needs a filter. But we also said that if we want to do this the right way, we need to lean on God as our filter. So instead of just firing off the email when I'm upset, or instead of responding with the text where I've gotten frustrated, we need to stop and say, God, what would you say? In this situation, in this moment, what would you say? What would you have me say? And so the rest of chapter 3, James just continues this conversation about the tongue and the mouth and using this to engage the community in the right way. And at the very end of the chapter, he gets to a point where he says, you should be known, if you are a follower of Jesus, if you are one who is engaging your faith, you should be known as a peacemaker. Your words should make a difference in that you are one who brings peace to communities and relationships around you. So that's where he was in chapter 3. Really, chapter 4 is just continuing this conversation. If you go back to the way it was originally written, this is just a letter, right? We came along hundreds of years after James wrote this letter and said, let's put in chapter numbers and verses so that we can find it in public settings quickly. But it's just a letter. And so James, he's continuing the same thought as we get into chapter 4, where he's talking about developing relationships the right way, handling your tongue in the right way. But the shift that he uses here is really one where he says, you know, he's kind of showing us what we need to do, Lean on God as your filter. And in chapter 4, he kind of gets to the point where he says, but this is what we typically do. This is actually the way that this typically plays out. And so let's just start reading. We'll read a verse and then stop and talk and just keep going. So James chapter 4, verse 1 says this. It says, what causes fights and quarrels among you? So like I said, opposite of building up community, now he starts talking about what's causing fights and quarrels among you. He says, don't they come from your desires that battle within you? And then the first part of verse 2, he says this, you want something, but you don't get it. I mean, let's just be honest for a second. He's pretty spot on, right? What causes fights? What causes quarrels? What causes the breakdown of families and relationships and community? You want something and you don't get it. We always want people to see things the way that we see them, right? We always want people to be on the same page that we're on. And sometimes that just doesn't happen, right? Again, if you're in a marriage, you know how this works. There are times where you have a certain sum of money and one spouse says, we need to spend this money on our bills. We have to pay our bills. And the other spouse says, yeah, but I already invited some friends over for the pay-per-view fight that's happening tonight. And so we need some of that money for this thing that I want to do over here. Or one spouse says, we need to pay our mortgage with this money. And the other one says, I have this event coming up and I haven't bought any new clothes in a really long time and I have to look nice for this event. So I really need some of this money for a new outfit, And so even though there's two people that care about each other, love each other, you come to a situation where you're saying, well, this is what I want. And the other person's saying, but this is what I want. And James says, this is the whole issue. This is the whole problem. As some of you guys know, I do marriage counseling as a pastor. And I hate to tell you this, I'm not a good marriage counselor because here's the thing. I sit down with people and it's just like, if you would just understand this, if you would just get to the point where you stop saying me first, everything would work. But people don't want to hear that in marriage counseling, right? They don't want you to tell them, just get over yourself and everything will be good, because that hurts. But that's what James is saying right here. He's saying if you would just come to a point where you stop putting yourself ahead of everybody else, things would get a whole lot better. Things would develop in this relationship a whole lot better than they have been, right? But that's what he's saying here. So he goes on in verse 2 and he says this, you want something but don't get it. You kill and covet, but you cannot have what you want. You quarrel and fight. You do not have because you do not ask God. And so he shifts the conversation a little bit here. He says, you're in all of these disputes, all of these arguments, because you have this attitude of me first. Because you have this mindset of, I'm going to get what I need to get. I'm going to get what I want to get. It says you have that attitude, and you haven't even asked God about this. You haven't even gone to God and said, is this something I need? or said, God, I need this. Can you provide it? He says you're just running over people to make sure you get what you want, to make sure it goes your way. That's what the issue is. So he says, why don't you consider going to God? Have you ever thought about that? God may actually have what you need. Rather than you forcing it out of somebody else, God may actually have what you need. And then he gives some clarity to that. So he talks a little bit further about prayer. In verse 3, he says, when you ask God, you do not receive because you ask with wrong motives, that you may spend what you get on your own pleasures. I'm sure none of you guys are guilty of this, but there have been times in my life where I've gone to God, I've gone in prayer, and I've said, God, I really want this, whatever this is, right? I really hope that you will bring this into my world, this into my life, because life would be so much better if I just got this, right? There's a tendency at times to go to God and say, will you just carry out my desires for a little while? That would be awesome if you would just take care of the things that I really want, right? And James comes to us and he says, and you wonder why you're not getting answers to your prayers. You wonder why it feels like the prayers are hitting the ceiling and not going any further. You wonder why God is not answering you. He says the whole issue is your attitude. It's the motive that you have when you go to him in prayer. He said the problem is you've been living out the things of the world. When you're saying, I want my way, you're living out the things of the world, not the things of God. When you say, I'm going to make sure that I get what I want, what I need, you're totally doing this backwards of what God wants you to do. And so he says, even in prayer, this is not a way to develop the relationship. You don't go with a me first attitude if you want to develop the relationship the right way. Have you ever stopped to think about the prayer that Jesus taught us as the model prayer? I don't know if you, maybe when you were a kid, when you were in school, or if you went to, church school or Catholic school or whatever, if you had to memorize the Lord's Prayer as a child. I remember when I had to memorize it. I was in 7th grade, I was playing football, and our football team would recite the Lord's Prayer in a circle together every game before we went out and played. And I grew up in the church, but not in a church where we recited the Lord's Prayer frequently, and so I would be standing there in the circle kind of fumbling through, mumbling different words, and so I finally realized, I've got to memorize this just so I don't look bad in front of everybody else, right? And so I memorized it. Maybe you had a similar experience, but think about what Jesus taught us to pray. He starts off by saying, Our Father. He doesn't go to him and say, God, my Father. He doesn't say, let me tell you what I need. He comes with a communal attitude, with an attitude of, Our Father. And then after that, he comes to the point where he says, God, your will be done. Your kingdom come. He doesn't say, please just do what I'm asking you. Just this once. That's not the heart of the way that Jesus prayed. He came with this mindset of, I am putting the community above myself. And obviously God is above me. Right? So he comes with this incredibly humble attitude, where he says, I am considering others before I consider myself, whether that's engaging in relationships or whether that's in prayer or whatever it may be. I am considering others before I consider myself. This is kind of the key. This is where James is pointing us. This is where he's taking us here, guys. He is showing us if you want to develop relationships in the right way, if you want to engage your faith in the right way, there's going to have to be this element of humility where you're saying, you know what, I'm looking at the people around me and I am willing to take one for the team right now. I am willing to put others ahead of me when it comes to these issues. Now, going on in verse 4, he starts off verse 4 with this incredibly strong language where he says this. After he's talked to them about the issue of me first, he says this. He says, you adulterous people. And he's talking to believers here, right? He's talking to people that have followed Jesus, have said they're following Jesus, but he calls them adulterous, and it's almost like, whoa, a little intense here, James, back up a little bit. But what he's saying is he's saying, you as believers, you have essentially made a vow with God. It's almost like you have gotten into a marriage with God, right? You have this vow with God where you've said to God, I am following you, I am giving my life to you. But right after you said that, you turned around and you decided, yeah, I said that, but I'm still pursuing me on this side. I'm still pursuing my way, my desires on this side. And James says that's like adultery. That's like getting into a marriage and making a vow to your spouse. And then right after you make this vow to your spouse, you turn around and say, yeah, but I'm still going to hang on to this person and this person on the side over here. I'm still going to seek my stuff on the side. So he says, you adulterous people. Then he goes on and says, don't you know that friendship with the world is hatred for God? Anyone who chooses to be a friend of the world becomes an enemy of God. So he's saying, you say that you are committed to the things of God, but you're just doing what everybody else in the world does. You're just living according to the standards and the ways of the world rather than living according to the standards and ways of Jesus. And so he says, if you want to engage your faith, that has to change. It has to be different. In verse 5, he says, or do you think that Scripture says without reason that the Spirit he calls to live in us envies intensely? That word envies is a word that we usually hear in negative connotations, right? Jealousy and envy and that kind of stuff is stuff that the Bible says stay away from this. But in this context, again, it's kind of giving us the marriage picture here where it's saying it's like you and God are married and he looks at you so lovingly that he's hoping you will look at him alone, that you will have eyes for him alone, right? And so it says he envies for you. He longs for you. He passionately cares about you. But you are still pursuing your own stuff rather than pursuing him. Now, in verse 6, James wraps all of this up and gives us kind of the big thought, the big idea here. He says, but he, meaning God, gives us more grace. That's why Scripture says God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. If we were to boil all of this down and put it in one statement that I think James is trying to say to us this morning, the thing that James is really saying is he's saying humility is the cornerstone of great communities. Humility is the cornerstone of great families and great office environments and great churches and great towns. Humility is where all of it starts. If you don't build on that foundation, nothing else is going to work appropriately. So James says, as you come to engage your faith, remember this, humility matters so much. Like I said, it's really easy to say this stuff. It's really easy to shake our head and, yeah, that's right. But when it comes to living it out, sometimes that's a different story, right? I want to give you just a real world example of how this has worked, even in our context in the last few weeks. If you've been around Trailhead, you know that we've been talking about the fact that we are coming to the point where we need all of the money in place so that we can have a down payment on the building. We're getting ready to purchase the facility that we're sitting in right now. And about 2-3 weeks ago, I told you guys, I said, we need to have all of this money in place. We need $100,000, which to me, I mean, maybe that's nothing to you. To me, that's a lot of money. Right? We need $100,000. That's stipulated in our contract in order to move forward with the purchase of the building. And I shared with you a couple of weeks ago, we were about $7,000 short of that number. And so I just asked you to pray about it and see how God led you. And what you guys did absolutely blew me away, absolutely amazed me. How you stepped up, and what you did was you said, I'm going to put the needs of the community ahead of myself for just a little while. And sacrificially you gave, not only did you give the $7,000 that we needed, but over the course of basically 2 weeks, you guys gave over $30,000. Absolutely unbelievable. And as unbelievable as it is that happened, do you know what happened as a result of that? We went to apply for a grant that we knew that we were going to be applying for this grant to help us get to this point where we could purchase the building. And so we go to them, and I wasn't even there because I had to be down in Denver on Tuesday and Wednesday. And so Randy and Gene and Alex went and met with the trustees that were the ones that are kind of over the decisions about this grant that we're applying for. And they shared the story of what you guys had done. They shared the story of the fact that over the last few weeks, you guys had given sacrificially to get us to the point where we could do this. They told them, not in these words, but they told them, you know what, they put themselves below the needs of the community. They gave sacrificially. And as a result of that, those trustees did two things. They first of all said, well, we actually know of one other grant that you haven't applied for, so we want to give you the resources to apply for this other grant, which is amazing. And then they said, and we're just going to assume that you're going to get that grant. This was a matching grant, so they were matching what we did, right? And so they said, we're just going to assume that you're going to get that grant. So they said, we want to put the needs of your community above our own interest right now as well. And they ended up saying, we are going to give you $100,000 for the down payment on this building. Isn't that amazing? Absolutely amazing. And so in a very short period of time, God has taken us from being in a place where we're like, how are we going to get this done, to being at a point where it's like, we can knock this thing out. You know, this is going to happen. This is amazing, right? And all of that happened because of an attitude that was adopted by you guys where you said, we're going to consider the needs of others before we consider ourselves. We're going to consider the interests of others before we think about our own interests. All of that happened because we laid the foundation on the cornerstone of humility. That's why the things happened the way that they did. And so let me just challenge you to bring this into everyday life, right? We've done this on a scale where it's an amazing thing what you guys have done. But let me challenge you not to start thinking, look at what I did. Look at what I was a part of. Instead of that, let me challenge you to think about it in this way. What if you started thinking, what would it look like if I lived this way every day? What would it look like if I thought of the needs and interests of others ahead of my own every single day? James kind of says, that's it. That's the engagement that I want you to have. That's the humility that I want you to have. And so what if that friend comes to you this week and you know who that friend is? That friend that needs a little bit more of your time than you really want to give. That friend who always wants to talk longer on the phone, always wants to sit and have coffee, and you're thinking, I've got 1,000 things to do. I need to get this done. What if that friend comes to you this week and says, you know what? I really need to hang out and just talk to you about some stuff. And you're thinking, oh, I've got this to do, this to do, this to do, and they have a deadline, and I've got to get this done. What if instead of thinking about our own interests, we put the interests and needs of others first? What if your spouse comes home and has had a hard day and looks at the kitchen and it's a mess and says, I'm just exhausted. Is there any way you could do the dishes for me today? Instead of looking at the chore chart and saying, well, my day is Friday. I'm sorry, about all this stuff. But instead of that, what if we said absolutely and put the needs of others ahead of our own interests? What would that do to our families? What would that do to our church if we started living that way? What would happen if every one of us had the mentality and the mindset of, you know what, I am willing to take one for the team because that's what's going to build this community in the way that it needs to be built. James says that humility is the cornerstone of building right relationships, of building healthy communities. This is the way that it has to be done. So this week, as we walk through this week, maybe the thing that we ought to really pursue is not pursuing the ways of the world that says me first, but maybe we ought to pursue a mindset and an attitude that says I'm going to consider the needs of others before I consider my own needs, because that's what God does for me. Humility. We resist it. We struggle to do this. But it's the cornerstone of building great relationships. Let's go to God and ask Him to help us with this.